On the night of August 21st, 1831, a preacher knelt in a field in Southampton County, Virginia, and decided that God had finally given him his sign. By the following evening, 55 people were dead. The most lethal slave revolt in American history had begun and ended in less than 24 hours. But the story of what came before that night and what came after is far more disturbing than most people realize. Because what followed was not justice. What followed was a massacre, a cover-up, and a set of laws designed to ensure that nothing like it could ever happen again. Today, we'll tell you how one man's rebellion shook an entire nation to its foundation, and how the powerful responded by tightening their grip even harder. Nat Turner was born in 1800 on a plantation in Southampton County, Virginia. His enslaver, Benjamin Turner, allowed him to be taught to read and write. This was extraordinarily rare. For the vast majority of enslaved people in America at that time, literacy was not just denied, it was illegal. But young Nat absorbed everything. He read the Bible obsessively. He memorized passages from Isaiah, Ezekiel, Revelation, and the Gospels. By the time he was a young man, the other enslaved people on the plantation regarded him as something close to a prophet. He fasted for days. He prayed in the fields. He reported visions in which the Spirit spoke to him directly. And he became convinced, with absolute certainty, that God had chosen him to lead his people out of bondage. In May of 1828, Turner experienced what he described as a divine revelation. The Spirit told him that the time was fast approaching when the first should be last, and the last should be first. It was a biblical inversion, a promise of violent reckoning. Turner was told to wait for a sign, and he waited. Then, on February 12, 1831, a solar eclipse darkened the skies over Southampton County. Turner believed that was his signal. He began recruiting. He approached 4 enslaved men he trusted absolutely. He told them the moment had come. The original plan was to begin the revolt on July 4th, a date with obvious symbolic weight in a nation that called itself the home of freedom. But Turner fell ill. The plan collapsed. He waited again. Then, on August 13th, the sky turned an unusual blue-green color, a strange atmospheric disturbance. Most people saw an odd natural event. Turner saw the hand of God. 8 days later, he moved. On the night of August 21st, Turner and a small group of men gathered at a cabin in the woods and ate a meal together. What they said to each other in those hours is not recorded, but by the time they were done eating, they had made their decision. They went first to the home of Joseph Travis, Turner's enslaver. The Travis family was killed as they slept. Turner and his men took weapons and horses and moved on to the next farm. For approximately 18 hours, the rebels were unchecked. They moved from farm to farm across Southampton County. They killed men, women, and children. Ultimately, the number of dead reached at least 55. As they traveled, Turner's group tried to grow. Free black men and enslaved men on the farms they visited were recruited or compelled to join. Their numbers swelled to as many as 60. But here lies a crucial fact that most retellings overlook. At the largest plantations, where Turner expected to find the most willing recruits, most people refused to join. The uprising Turner had imagined, a massive, coordinated liberation, never materialized. His army remained small, and small armies do not survive long against artillery. Less than 24 hours after it began, the rebellion effectively ended at James Parker's farm, where the rebels encountered organized resistance and were routed. Turner and a few others fled into the woods. The militia arrived in overwhelming force. They had twice the manpower of the rebels and 3 companies of artillery. The outcome was never really in doubt once the organized response began. But what happened next is the part of this story that most textbooks skim past. Because the violence didn't stop when the rebellion was suppressed. In many ways, it only accelerated. White militias, vigilantes, and soldiers fanned out across Southampton County and beyond. In the days following the rebellion, more than 3,000 armed men were deployed. They killed more than 100 people suspected of participating in the uprising. Here is the critical detail. Most of those people had no involvement in Turner's rebellion whatsoever. Innocent men and women were executed without trials. Suspected rebels were beheaded and their severed heads mounted on poles at crossroads as a warning. One newspaper editor who traveled to the county and witnessed the retaliation was forced to admit that the white violence was, in his words, hardly inferior in barbarity to the atrocities of the rebels. This was not justice. This was terror, systematic and deliberate. Turner himself was not captured. He hid near the original site of the rebellion, moving only at night, surviving for weeks in the woods and beneath a pile of fence rails. For 6 weeks, he barely moved at all, leaving his hiding place only in darkness to find water. Then he spent 2 more weeks listening to conversations at night to gather intelligence. He was pursued almost constantly in the final stretch. 10 full weeks after the rebellion began, 2 enslaved men spotted him near his hiding spot. He could no longer evade capture. On October 30th, 1831, Nat Turner was taken into custody. While he sat in jail awaiting trial, a local lawyer named Thomas Gray approached him. Gray wanted to record Turner's account of the rebellion and publish it. Turner agreed. He spoke freely, at length, and with remarkable composure. The document that resulted, published within weeks of Turner's execution, became known as the Confessions of Nat Turner. Historians have debated Gray's editorial role for nearly 2 centuries. There is little doubt that Gray shaped some of the language, but most scholars agree that the core account is broadly accurate. What emerges from the Confessions is not the portrait of a man who was unstable or confused. It is the portrait of a man who was utterly convinced of his mission and unafraid of what was coming. Turner was tried and convicted. He was hanged on November 11th, 1831. But what was done to his body afterward represents one of the most grotesque chapters in this story. After the execution, his body was dissected. His skin was used to make souvenir purses. His bones were preserved as a medical specimen by a local doctor. Decades later, in 1897, Virginia newspapers reported that Turner's skeleton was still being displayed as a curiosity. A man who had lived, prayed, planned, and died for the liberation of his people had been reduced, quite literally, to a novelty item. If you are not disturbed by that, you should be. 31 people were formally tried in connection with the rebellion. 30 slaves and 1 free black man were condemned to death. 19 were executed. Governor John Floyd commuted 12 sentences. The trials were swift. Defense was largely performative. Meanwhile, Turner's wife Cherry was beaten and tortured by authorities trying to learn where her husband was hiding. Investigators had found papers on the Reese plantation, and a report from the Richmond Constitutional Whig stated plainly that those papers had been given up under the lash. Even enslaved people who had actively protected white families during the uprising were not safe. One man named Hubbard was nearly executed despite having saved his mistress. He survived only because she appeared in time to vouch for him. The political fallout was immediate and in some ways extraordinary. Virginia's legislature actually debated abolishing slavery in the weeks after the rebellion. Thomas Jefferson's own grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, introduced a gradual emancipation bill. It failed by a narrow margin. It was the last time Virginia would seriously consider ending slavery until the Civil War forced the issue 30 years later. Instead of reform, the legislature chose repression. New laws were passed that restricted the rights of both enslaved and free black people to travel, to gather, and to worship without white supervision. And because Turner had been educated, because Turner had been a preacher, the new laws specifically targeted literacy. Educating enslaved people became not just discouraged, but explicitly criminalized. Other slaveholding states followed Virginia's example. Across the South, the legal framework around slavery was tightened dramatically in the years after 1831. Free black people lost rights they had previously held. Assemblies of any kind required white oversight. Teaching any black person to read became a criminal act. Here lies the tragic and infuriating irony at the center of this story. The rebellion of one educated, religiously literate man convinced the white South that education itself was the threat. And so they responded not by examining whether slavery was wrong, but by ensuring that enslaved people would have fewer tools than ever to challenge it. Turner had destroyed one of the most comfortable myths of the slaveholding South. That myth held that enslaved people were content, that they were too docile, too passive, too attached to their enslavers to resist. Turner obliterated that fantasy in one night, and white Southerners never quite recovered from the shock of it. The response to the rebellion, the mass killings, the restrictive legislation, the propaganda campaign to frame Turner as a monster, reveals how deeply that shock ran. You do not need martial law and decades of new repression to contain a threat you are not truly afraid of. There was also a personal dimension to Turner's decision that history has largely overlooked. In February of 1831, just days before Turner made first contact with his future conspirators, a man named John Reese signed a legal document that put Turner's own son up as collateral for a debt. Turner's son could have been sold to satisfy another man's financial obligations. This was the reality of slavery in its most intimate and devastating form. The theological language Turner used to explain his rebellion was real. His faith was genuine. But the threat to his own child may have been the match that finally ignited everything. Rebellion is rarely born from a single cause. Turner's rebellion did not end slavery. It did not even slow the expansion of slavery in the decades that followed. What it did was prove, definitively and at enormous cost, that the myth of the content and passive slave was exactly that, a myth. Turner's name was used for generations afterward to frighten white Southerners into tighter solidarity around the institution of slavery. His memory was weaponized against the very cause he gave his life for, and his body was turned into a souvenir. But the confessions survived. The record survived. And for nearly 2 centuries, historians have returned to that document, to that voice, to try to understand what drove one man to set in motion events that changed American history forever.